happy to have on the show today Dr. Fazale Rana of Reasons to Believe. Welcome to the show, Fuz.
Don, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Many people in the Christian world, particularly in America, are concerned that scientists go into science to get away from their Christian faith or get away from Christianity. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you got started in science?
Well, first of all, I didn't grow up in a Christian home, so it wasn't really trying to run away or run towards my faith that motivated me to pursue science. But really, it was ultimately a love of science itself. And I wasn't one of those children that was a prodigy that was interested in science from the very early days.
So you weren't Hugh Ross?
No, I wasn't. I wasn't collecting pop bottles to build a telescope. I was collecting pop bottles to cash them in for money to buy comic books. But as I didn't really care much actually for science in elementary school or in high school. I was a good student in science and math, and it was really when it came time to go to college that my father thought that maybe I ought to consider enrolling in a pre-med program and pursue a career in medicine, because again, I was a really good student. And I thought, well, I don't have anything else better to do, so why not? And it was the first day of class in Biology 101 that really hooked me. And it was dealing with the question, what is life? That was the first thing we talked about in biology class, which makes sense. If you're going to study biology, you want to know what it is that you're exactly studying.
Did he come up with a definition for you that covers all life?
Well, that was the thing that would intrigue me, is that I learned that a perennial problem in biology is the inability to define what life is. So biologists are great at describing life, but they can't actually define it. And so as I thought about that, I thought this is really intriguing. And to me, I felt like the two areas of science that would have the greatest chance of really providing insight into that question was biochemistry, which is the study of the molecules that make up life itself. So these would be the fundamental systems in biology. And it would be the origin of life question. How do we explain how life emerges on Earth? And so since that time, I've been long fascinated with both biochemistry and the origin of life, and very quickly decided that I didn't want to go to medical school. I really wanted to pursue a career as a biochemist. So I was a late bloomer when it came to my love and my interest in science. But to me, I think the good news is, or the word of encouragement is, it doesn't matter where you are in your life experiences, how young or how old you are. Science is fascinating, and it's never too late to get immersed in science. And I know a lot of people who, after they've retired, have gone back and have earned master's degrees or PhD degrees just for the sheer enjoyment of doing that in their retirement. So you're never too late, I guess, to gain interest in science.
Today, the people who make the news are the scientists who are specifically anti-religious, the Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett types. And there's even documentaries about the hostility towards intelligent design in the academic world. Do you recommend that Christians pursue science?
Oh, I absolutely wholeheartedly do. And it doesn't matter really who you are as a Christian in terms of your interest or your background or your what you feel you are good at. Everybody should be interested in science, because science is about investigating the world of nature, and the world of nature is God's creation. And Scripture teaches us that God has revealed himself to us through the record of nature. And so the more that we learn about the record of nature, the more we're going to have an opportunity to see God's handiwork. But also Scripture tells us we see God's character through what he has made. And so we gain some insight into who God is from the record of nature. And so I see the study of science as really an act of worship first and foremost. But also science is a very powerful way of understanding the world around us that allows us also to fulfill our mission as Christians, which is to love other people. And that means doing what we can to serve people that are suffering, to try to do what we can to promote human flourishing. And so for a young person, to go into science could really be viewed as really a calling into ministry, a ministry of service, to your fellow human beings, but also an opportunity for you to serve God and serve the church as a type of worship leader, if you will.
What have been the biggest challenges that you faced in your career in science?
I've never felt as being someone who is a Christian in science, really, frankly, much hostility, at least when I was pursuing my studies, or even in my career when I worked at a Fortune 500 company in research and development. So I've never really felt hostility. Now, people in the scientific community are unhappy with the fact that I embrace the idea of design and biology, that I'm an advocate of intelligent design, that I see purpose or teleology in biology. So that does meet with hostility, but I never viewed that as being something that represented, quote unquote, a challenge of sorts, more so really fundamentally different commitments to philosophical systems that would undergird the operation of science. So if there is a challenge that I feel today, it's really battling the influence of methodological naturalism, which is the idea that when you engage in science, you suspend belief in God and you only pursue mechanistic explanations for the world around us and phenomena within the world. And that approach is fine when you're dealing with what we would call proximal causes, where you're trying to understand, again, things that are the indirect causes for things. But in terms of ultimate causes, which really relate to questions of origins, methodological naturalism, I think, is an insufficient philosophy for science, and really restricts the fact that there is actually scientific evidence that points to a creator, and really robs science of being able to speak into that evidence.
Do you feel like sometimes your colleagues confuse or conflate methodological naturalism with philosophical naturalism?
I think there are many people in the scientific community who really sincerely believe that methodological naturalism is indeed distinct from philosophical naturalism, even people that might actually be non-theistic in their worldview perspective. But the fact of the matter is that when you are operating in a framework of methodological naturalism, you're seeking the least common denominator, and that is essentially an atheistic, materialistic approach to science. So in effect, methodological naturalism renders science to be indistinguishable from that operated by somebody who is a philosophical naturalist. So I think methodological naturalism inherently makes science atheistic.
As a scientist, and you talked about your love of science and your growth and knowledge in your studies, can you tell us about your journey to faith, that side of your life?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't grow up in a Christian home and didn't have any kind of Christian influences in my life. When I left high school and went into college, I was an agnostic for all intents and purposes. As a college student taking courses in chemistry and biology, I was persuaded that evolutionary processes could explain the origin and the design and the history of life. But that persuasion wasn't the evidence for the evolutionary paradigm. It was really the authority of the professors that I had. And these were men and women that I deeply respected and admired, even to this very day. And they taught, well, the mainstream view is an evolutionary approach to biology. And so I accepted it really uncritically. And it was in graduate school where I began to immerse myself in the study of biochemical systems that I quickly came to appreciate the incredible elegance and sophistication and ingenuity of these systems. That is, they really looked like they were designed. And at that point, I really wanted then to understand, how do we explain where biochemical systems come from? That's the origin of life problem. And found those explanations to be really inadequate. That was 35 years ago or so. And even today, 3.5 decades later, I still think that the origin of life represents a very serious challenge to the evolutionary paradigm. But it was really the combination of the design I saw in biochemistry and the inability of evolution to explain that design that convinced me there must be a mind behind everything. And that then opened me up to pursuing other questions like, who is that mind? How do I relate to that mind? And I felt like Christianity offered the best explanation for those two really important questions.
So that brings up an interesting question then. There's the theory of evolution, evolutionary theory, a neo-Darwinian paradigm, et cetera, which begins when life began. And then there's the origin of life and the chemical evolution that's happens according to the standard paradigm that resulted in the first life. First off, when did life begin on Earth?
Yeah, well, the evidence that we have from the scientific record indicates that life appears on Earth practically as soon as you could even, as it's even conceivable that the Earth could support life. And so the scientific evidence when it comes to planetary formation indicates that the Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. And traditionally, people have argued that for the first several hundred million years, the Earth was in effect a molten planet where there was no solid crust on the Earth. There was no large bodies of water on the Earth. It was essentially a molten planet. And as the Earth began to cool down and the crust formed and oceans becoming established as permanent features, which would be in the neighborhood of really about 3.8 to 4 billion years ago, we see in the geochemical record in the oldest rocks on Earth that date to that age, a very clear geochemical and even fossil evidence that microorganisms were already present on the Earth. And these microorganisms appear to be metabolically rather sophisticated organisms that really constituted a complex microbial ecology. And so this is astounding from an evolutionary perspective, because traditionally people thought it would be hundreds of millions, if not up to 1 billion years for life to originate. And really the window of time for the origin of life is on the order of really tens of millions of years. And that's just too narrow of a window for life's origin to be explained through chemical evolution.
Was there a Darwinian murky pond? Was there a prebiotic soup? Is there evidence that such a concentration of materials that could eventually become life were concentrated in one area?
Well, this idea of life emerging out of a prebiotic soup is a cornerstone idea in biological evolution, in the evolutionary paradigm. It shows up in textbooks all the time, but yet we see, in effect, no evidence whatsoever for a prebiotic soup. If a prebiotic soup did exist, you'd expect there to be evidence for that soup in the geochemical record in the oldest rocks on Earth, which again date in the neighborhood of 3.8 to 4 billion years in age. And the fact of the matter is we do see a chemical residue, but that residue indicates that it was formed through biological activity. There's no evidence for a chemical residue formed through abiotic processes. In other words, there's no evidence whatsoever that there was a prebiotic soup that was ever present on the early Earth. And so this is really astounding to think that this idea of life coming out of a prebiotic soup is actually really a scientific myth. It's not an established scientific fact whatsoever. In fact, the evidence seems to argue against that.
In 1953, Miller and Urey came out with their discovery of ways to build amino acids based on what they believed that the prebiotic soup or the chemical conditions on earliest Earth were. Is that the currently accepted version of how the early Earth was, or has things changed since 1953 as far as our understanding of the chemistry of the early Earth?
Well, the Miller-Urey experiment, as you mentioned, is kind of a staple in biology textbooks again, and it's meant to demonstrate the idea that chemical evolution is indeed feasible, because Miller was trying to simulate the early Earth's atmosphere, and and what the effect of lightning discharges through that atmosphere could do in terms of creating organic materials like amino acids. But we now know that the conditions used by Miller in his experiment are not the conditions that would have existed on the early Earth. So in the intervening years, we have a better understanding of what the Earth's atmosphere would look like. And it was very different than what Miller thought. And in the most current understanding of the Earth's atmosphere, there's no way that you can generate any kind of organic materials under simulated early Earth conditions. That atmosphere is essentially a sterile atmosphere in terms of being chemically productive. So the Miller-Urey experiment is historically relevant, but in a practical sense is irrelevant to the origin of life question.
So I kind of hacked around at this earlier, but what is chemical evolution?
Yeah, well, chemical evolution is really part of the evolutionary paradigm, and it's the notion that not only does life have an evolutionary history, but that an evolutionary process even led to the generation of the very first cells. But here we're not talking about biological evolution, but rather initially an evolutionary process that involves simple gaseous materials on the early Earth that would undergo reactions to form organic materials that would accumulate in the Earth's oceans. And then over time, they would react to form the building block materials of life that then would undergo further complexification and aggregation to form these chemical supersystems that would assume essentially ever increasingly the properties of life. And so the idea here is that life would have evolved from simple molecules into increasingly complex molecules that aggregate into these protocellular systems. And that once these protocells could undergo some kind of replication, then the thought is that Darwinian evolution would kick in at that point, kind of driving these protocells into to form essentially or evolve into the very first true cells. So it's essentially the notion of evolution really extended into the chemical realm as a way to explain how life got started.
We see in the newspapers and on television, quite often you'll see scientists now believe they found evidence that meteors brought in X building block or Y building block, and that we know more and we're practically this close to solving the origin of life on Earth. What is the currently accepted paradigm, or is there a currently accepted paradigm for how life began on Earth?
There is no accepted paradigm at all. So there's a bewildering array of ideas on how chemical evolution could have transpired. Some argue that it was the way that Miller conceived it, that it was atmospheric chemistry that generated the prebiotic materials that accumulated in the Earth's oceans. Others argue, well, maybe it was the chemistry that would take place in volcanoes that would be present on the early Earth in the outgassing,
Or steam vents I've seen.
Yeah, hydrothermal vents deep in the Earth's oceans is another idea. Some argue that maybe asteroids and comets would have delivered prebiotic materials to the early Earth. So this is a variation of an idea called Panspermia. And then once you've got these building blocks, there's a variety of different ways in which they would again form protocellular entities. Some argue it was the emergence of replicating molecules that led to the first steps towards the origin of life. Others argue is the formation of these autocatalytic cycles involving small molecules, and others argue that it was the formation of membranes. So these are a number of different scenarios that are in play.
I think in about 1975, was it that Francis Crick came out with his book that the first I heard of, came up with the idea of panspermia, that life was, whether consciously or otherwise, brought here from other places. Is there some form of panspermia in play for the origin of life?
Yeah, panspermia is really a very important set of ideas that are part of the exploration for trying to understand how life could emerge through some kind of chemical evolution. And and there are different versions of this idea. One is that it was essentially through extraterrestrial delivery mechanisms that prebiotic materials accumulated on the early Earth, that these would have formed very early in the solar system's formation, or maybe even were indigenous to the solar system, forming in the gas nebula that collapsed and condensed to form our solar system. And then you had comets and asteroids and interplanetary dust particle infall that delivered the organics to the Earth. Others argue that maybe life could have originated, let's say, on Mars and then was transported to the Earth, where the origin of life would have happened on Mars, or maybe something like the moons of Jupiter, like Europa or Titan. Others argue that maybe life originated in another star system and was then traveled to our Earth through interstellar space travel. So these are different variations of this idea of panspermia. But part of the motivation for proposing these ideas is the recognition that there isn't a prebiotic soup on the early Earth, that even trying to explain the origin of life at hydrothermal vents or in volcanic outgassing really is replete with a number of problems. And then you also have the fact that life seems to appear suddenly and very early in Earth's history. And so the thought is, well, maybe extraterrestrial delivery could provide us a source of prebiotic material so we don't have to worry how they could form on Earth. Or, if life appears so early in Earth's history, maybe life never evolved on Earth, but was rather delivered to the Earth. And that could explain, its early appearance and its sudden appearance on Earth. So the appeal to panspermia is really reflecting some intractable problems with more traditional evolutionary explanations.
It sounds fairly simple to me. You just get a meteor, it becomes a meteorite, and inside of it somewhere is some kind of proto-cell or perhaps a fully developed life from another world. That sounds fairly simple. What kind of challenges would this transportation of the major building blocks and or life to Earth, what kind of challenges would that have to overcome?
Well, when you talk about the extraterrestrial delivery of prebiotics to the early Earth, there's a number of problems. One is we do know that some types of meteorites, like the carbonaceous chondrites, are rich in organics. But even then, the level of organic material that you could deliver to the early Earth would just simply be way too low to ever form a substantially high enough concentration on the Earth to be meaningful for the origin of life. These materials, when they would be delivered to the Earth, would be diluted out in the Earth's oceans to very low concentrations. Assuming that they could even survive the process of these meteorites entering the Earth's atmosphere, undergoing frictional heating, and then the collision with the Earth would be so energetic that it would essentially destroy those organic materials that would be associated with it. And then going back to the geological and geochemical record, if indeed there was extraterrestrial delivery of prebiotic materials, we would see that in the oldest rocks on Earth. We would see organic residues that would be rich in deuterium and rich in carbon-13, and we don't see that. So that in and of itself rules out that as a viable explanation. Let's say you appeal to maybe life originating on Mars and then being transported to Earth. Well, there are transport mechanisms. There are transport mechanisms to be certain, but the problem is that the problems confronting the origin of life on Earth would be the same problems confronting the origin of life on Mars. So you're really not solving the problem, you're just trying to push it off to another location, but the location you're pushing it off to is no better or is not any more preferred than the environment of the Earth. With regard to interstellar panspermia, the likelihood of materials moving from one star system to another is so remote that that in and of itself, that eliminates that as a viable mechanism. And even if somehow you could get materials moving from one star system to the other, that interstellar journey would be so difficult in terms of the exposure to high energy radiation that any life forms in those materials would essentially be destroyed by, again, the high energy environment of interstellar space. and other sources of high energy radiation. So bottom line is interstellar panspermia has a transport problem. Interplanetary panspermia has the same problems as the problems confronting the origin of life, and then delivery of organic materials to the Earth just simply doesn't seem to have the evidential support for it.
I know that you've been to at least one Origins of Life conference, maybe more. Do you get the sense that the researchers are getting closer to settling the question of the origin of life on Earth?
No, there's no real progress being made in origin of life research whatsoever. I mean, we're really no closer to understanding the origin of life today than we were when Miller did his famous experiment nearly 70 years ago. And I attended 2 origin of life conferences in 1999 and 2002 in preparation for writing a book called Origins of Life that I co-authored with Hugh Ross. And a few years ago, I had a chance to go to another Origin of Life conference. This would have been, I think it was 2018 that I went, that this conference was held. And it was interesting to me that it had been almost 15 years since I'd been to an Origin of Life conference. And the discussion was essentially the same. It was as if I was transported back in time to 2002. In other words, the same questions were being debated, the same types of data that was being presented, with nothing that really looked to me to be revolutionary or substantial or suggested any kind of real progress whatsoever.
I know at one point they were hypothesizing the origin of life in clays. Is that long since gone?
The idea of the origin of life on clays is, again, part of the whole package that people are exploring. And it's a rather intriguing idea, because if you did have clays on the early Earth, which is likely to be the case, clays are a very special type of mineral that have layers that stack on each other, and in between the layers are these spaces that actually can accumulate organic materials. So the thought is clays would be a great environment to increase the local concentration of building block materials. You'd have these chemically active surfaces on clay that could serve as catalysts. It would be an environment that would be devoid largely of water. And so the thought is that this would be an ideal environment for prebiotic chemistry to take place. But the problem is that while we can do these wonderful experiments in the laboratory, looking at clays and their role hypothetically in the origin of life, these experiments that are done in the laboratory are so contrived that they essentially don't reflect in any way, shape, or form the condition of the early Earth. And so, yeah, clays are still very much part of the origin of life construct, but the experiments that are done, again, trying to demonstrate the role that clays could play for the origin of life in the laboratory are so far removed from what the conditions of the Earth would look like that those experiments are actually irrelevant. And if we could actually truly model what we think the conditions of the Earth would be like, there's no way that life could originate, and that clays could play any kind of real role in that.
Yeah, I always wondered how you can substitute, how the clay started it and were part of it and then got replaced by something else. I never quite understood how that was supposed to have happened, but that's perhaps because I'm ignorant. So, one of the problems I read they come across when they're doing the origin of life research is the problem of homochirality. What is homochirality and why is that a problem?
Yeah, well, to understand what homochirality is, we need to understand what chirality is. And chirality refers to a structural feature that some molecules have, and it arises when you have, for organic compounds, when you have a central carbon atom that has bound to it 4 different chemical substituents. And when you have that scenario, you can actually have those chemical substituents organized in space or oriented in space in 1 of 2 configurations that turn out to be mirror images of each other. And so this is called chirality. And compounds that are chiral will have, again, two configurations that are mirror images and are referred to as left-handed and right-handed forms. And the chemistry, generally speaking, of left-handed and right-handed versions of chiral compounds is in effect the same, although you can have differences arising because of the spatial orientation of those chemical groups. And it turns out that some of the building block materials for life, like sugars that make up DNA and RNA, or the amino acids that make up proteins, are actually chiral compounds. And they all turn out to be of the left-handed variety for amino acids that are the building blocks of proteins, and they turn out to be all the right-handed variety for the sugars that make up DNA and RNA. And when you have the chirality being of only one-handedness, that's referred to as homochirality. And homochirality is actually a strict requirement for life, because, for example, when we look at proteins have to adopt these very complex higher order three-dimensional structures that are stabilized by the interaction of the different groups that are part of the amino acids. And those interactions are stabilized in three-dimensional space and are dependent upon the orientation of the different chemical groups that are bound to the chiral carbon and amino acids. And so if you introduce amino acids of the opposite handedness, you disrupt this higher order three-dimensional structure, which means you're going to make it impossible for proteins to be functionally important molecules. So if you don't have a strict 100% homochirality in biomolecules, life isn't possible. And one of the major challenges in origin of life research is, how do you explain that condition of homochirality?